Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 11.6. As patch 11.6 was relatively small, there hasn't been a whole lot of changes in the meta. What worked on the last few patches is still doing well now. More than likely this trend will continue from now until the end of the set. Luckily there's plenty of diversity in the meta with most synergies being viable depending on the situation. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, we have the synergies in the S tier. This tier consists of Slayer, Daredevil, Mage, Executioner, and Blacksmith. These synergies have a lot of influence on the current meta and are used consistently in most games. At the top of our tier list, we have Slayer. This really should not be much of a surprise as the meta hasn't changed a whole lot in recent patches. Slayer has been dominating for quite a while thanks to the flexibility of the champions. Olaf, Tryndamere, and Samira are all top tier carries, which makes pivoting into Slayers much easier than most other synergies. All you really need are 3 Slayers to get a lot of benefits, so you can easily fill in the rest of your comp with splash synergies like Syphoner. Sitting alongside of Slayer is Daredevil. As mentioned, Samira is a top Slayer carry in the meta and possibly the best champion overall. There's few other champions that can compare to the damage output a 2-star Samira can do with full items and Slayer. She also does well as a secondary damage dealer to augment your board whether you're running Slayer or not. Next, we have Mage, as the flexibility of this trait is doing quite well in the meta. Of course, you need Aurelion Sol in order to play Mage, but the fact that you can run so many variations of Mage makes it a top tier synergy. The star of the show is still Aurelion Sol, as his damage output with Mage almost rivals the AoE damage of Samira. Overall, Mage is one of the most consistent synergies throughout the entire game. It's debatable whether Executioner deserves a spot in the S tier, as it's not quite up to par with both Slayer and Mage. But if you take a look at the meta and what players commonly play, Kayle with Executioner is near the most played by far. That consistency is why Executioner deserves this placement. The downside to Executioner is that it does lack flexibility, since you absolutely need Kayle 2 with good items in order to place well. Compared to, say, Aurelion Sol, who can skate by most of the game as a 1-star, or Slayers who have 3 different viable carries. Despite that downside, Executioner with Kayle is still a top tier synergy. And the last trait in the S tier is Blacksmith. Ornn once again finds his way into this tier as his artifacts continue to be highly valuable. It's really only due to the power of artifacts that Ornn continues to be highly valued, because as a champion he's rather lackluster since his ability frequently fails. But that's alright, since artifacts add a lot of extra power to a composition, since items are such an important part of TFT. That's it for the S tier, so let's move on to the synergies in the A tier. This tier consists of Keeper, Dragonsoul, Syphoner, Vanguard, Sharpshooter, Cultist, Adept, Exile, Brawler, and Mystic. These synergies are commonly used in top 4 compositions and are all around consistently useful. At the top of the A tier, we have Keeper. Keeper is a step above every other synergy besides those in the S tier. The reason is that Slayer, Mage, and Executioner all do a fair amount of AoE damage that Keeper can struggle against. This is because Keepers want to clump up to gain extra shields, which in turn means AoE is quite strong against them. That weakness aside, Keeper is definitely one of the strongest synergies with presence in the early, mid, and even the late game. Dragonsoul is in an interesting spot because of Aurelion Sol, Olaf, and Swain. These 3 champions are at the top of the meta, and that naturally increases the ranking of Dragonsoul, since it's common to run at least 3 Dragonsoul when using those champions. Those champions aside, the synergy does well on its own throughout the game, with Tristana carrying the early game, Shyvana the mid game, and the 3 aforementioned champions carrying in the late game. Syphoner is by far the best splash trait in the game right now, as extra healing benefits so many compositions. Plus, a lot of late game compositions run Swain, as he's one of the best late game champs. Morgana is also a common fixture in the meta, as she pairs well with Swain and has her own composition alongside a Talon. Vanguard has taken a bit of a fall in the meta, mostly because of how common Last Whisper has become. Since a lot of builds run Last Whisper, it's harder for Vanguards to be the sole frontline for a lot of builds, so we're seeing them a bit less than other frontlines a bit more. That said, you're never going to be in a bad position if you run Sejuani or Aatrox in your frontline. Next, we have Sharpshooter, which took a bit of a hit with the Tristana nerfs. Sivir is still doing well as a carry, and of course, in the late game, you have Samira. Despite Tristana 3 being nerfed, she's still quite strong in the early game as a 2-star champion, so while the presence of Sharpshooters is a bit diminished at 11.6, they're still doing well overall. the king of the mid game goes to Cultist, as this synergy is easily one of the strongest Stage 3 and Stage 4 comps. That is assuming you're able to hit 6 Cultists. After the mid game, this trait does fall off, though it is saved somewhat by Sivir, who is still used in the late game as a main carry when 3-starred. Adept has shot up in value thanks to the fall of Vanguards. Basically, Adept champions are being used more and more as frontliners, and of course, Yone in the late game is quite strong. Adept is also very easy to splash in, so it makes sense it's taking the place of Vanguard in some comps. Following Adept, we have Exile, which is essentially tied to the value of Yone. Sure, in the early game with Duelist, we do see Yasuo do well, but Exile in the current meta is all about Yone. And Yone right now is doing quite well, therefore, so is Exile. Nearing the end of A tier, we have Brawler. Brawlers are still trudging along as an all-around useful frontline synergy, but their power in the late game is definitely diminished and relies heavily on hitting Shyvana 3 with set 2. But overall, Brawlers are still a solid frontline choice, especially in the early game. And the last trait for the A tier is Mystic. Mystic doesn't have much value in the meta, as 2 Mystics doesn't quite cut it against a lot of the magic damage. Given how popular the trait is, we really can't place it any lower than A tier though. Let's now move on to the B tier synergies. This tier consists of Assassin, Warlord, Spirit, Duelist, Divine, Elderwood, Emperor, and the Boss. Overall, these synergies are capable of doing well in the current meta, but for the most part, they're just average at best. At the top of B tier, we have Assassins. Assassin in general is more or less a secondary trait for certain champions like Talon and Katarina. Full-on Assassin compositions are quite rare, though doable if you can 3-star Akali. Warlord got some nice buffs in 11.6 that have helped it rise up in the meta, though not by much. Essentially, the goal when using Warlords is to utilize them in the mid-game and pivot out of them later, similar to Cultist. Katarina 3 can still carry in the late game, but don't expect it to be all that consistent. Spirit is struggling slightly, as there's not many compositions utilizing it anymore, especially with Tristana 3 being nerfed. Still, Sivir does well with Force Spirit, and in rare cases, we can see Ninja Spirit doing well. Plus, it is a strong splash trait for compositions like Keeper or Executioner. As usual, Duelist is sitting comfortably in the B tier, as it can do well but lacks a lot of consistency. The saving grace for Duelist is when you have a spatula and can use it on Kayle in an Executioner composition. It's also worth mentioning that while Duelist isn't too important for Tryndamere, it is useful to run it with him if he's your main carry, especially since he opens the door to running Lee Sin. There's still really not a lot of uses for Divine in the meta outside of Kayle compositions, but since Kayle is doing well, that automatically boosts up the value of Divine. The only other aspect of Divine worth mentioning is that Lee Sin is still one of the best late-game 5-cost units. Elderwood is in a funny place right now because 3 Elderwood is quite common between Keeper builds and Mage builds. Even 6 Elderwood is playable when running a variation of 5 Mage composition. The main issue is that fights often are a bit too fast for the scaling to really matter for Elderwood, so the trait struggles against a lot of late-game compositions. And ending the B tier, we have 2 solo traits, Emperor and the Boss. Azir is a great champion for Keeper, but outside of that, he's not commonly used. Set is similar in that he has a lot of value in Brawler builds, but tends to fall flat in other comps. Both of these 5-cost champions are still worth 2-starring if you can, but they definitely have less of a presence in the meta compared to other late-game champions like Samira, Swain, and Lee Sin. And now we can move on to the last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Fabled, Ninja, Enlightened, and Fortune. These synergies are useful in the right situation, but have less of an impact on the meta than the tiers above. Kicking off our last tier, we have Fabled. Fabled is in an unfortunate spot as it can do well in the meta with Vanguard Mystic composition. But to do well, you have to hit Sejuani, Aatrox, and a Neeko 3. At the end of the day, you're at the whim of how high roll other players' boards are, so even snagging a win with Fabled can be difficult. The other issue is that Fabled has basically zero presence outside of that specific composition. Nautilus occasionally pops up in the early game, and Cho'Gath at least has value with Brawlers, but the trait itself is rarely ever used. Combining that lack of usage and the lack of consistency in the only build utilizing it, we have a reason as to why Fabled is in the C tier. Next, we have another struggling synergy, Ninja. Ninja, like Fabled, can do well with either a Z3 or an Akali 3 carry. Overall, though, you're rarely going to see players utilizing 4 Ninja and instead leaning on using the individual champions. Which, to be honest, the individual Ninja units are all fantastic. Kennen is used for keepers, Shen has a place thanks to Adept, Akali strong in the mid game, and Zed can occasionally be used in Slayer builds. But since we're considering Ninja about the whole trait and not the individual champions, it's clear that the synergy is lacking in the meta. Enlightened once again wallows away in the C tier because it really doesn't provide a whole lot. Both Talon and Morgana are fantastic champions in the meta, and using them together is quite common, so seeing at least 2 Enlightened is not all that rare. But when you really think about it, does Enlightened even matter for either of them? Morgana gains plenty of mana by being placed in the front line, while Talon cares way more about getting kill resets, so neither of them really utilize the increased mana generation. Since the other Enlightened units are barely even a factor in the meta, we're left with Enlightened as a trait being borderline useless. And the last trait to talk about, once again, is Fortune. As usual, let's preface this by saying yes, Fortune is really good when utilized well. The reason why we're firm on our stance that Fortune is low tier is how often it baits players into losing a ton of health without much benefit. Sure, that 8 loss payoff feels great, but for every player that gets an advantage out of playing that way, there's 4 other players that weren't able to make it work and lose as early as stage 4 because of it. The volatility of Fortune makes it too much of a wild card, so we recommend only playing it if you're really comfortable in pulling yourself out of a loss streak. That's all we have for today's tier list video. It's great that the meta is diverse, so you're never really stuck with a bad synergy. That said, it does feel a bit stale having the top of the meta continue to be dominated by Slayers. Let us know in the comment section below what you think about the current meta. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.